They say the Emperor protects, but they never tell you what he protects you from. I learned that lesson on my third deployment, when the sky turned the color of infected wounds and the ground beneath our boots started screaming. My name is Trooper Cadius Vex, 3rd Regiment, Mordian Iron Guard, or it was. Names matter less now than the weight of what I carry, the memories that follow me through the dark between worlds, and the certainty that every sunrise could be my last. I have served the Imperium for 14 years, survived 18 major engagements, and watched 743 men die under my command. These numbers define me more than any name ever could. The recruitment officer who found me in the underhive of Mordius Prime had clean hands and a pressed uniform. He spoke of glory, of service to the Golden Throne, of becoming something greater than the gutter-born scum I was. He lied about everything except the uniform. That, at least, was real. Everything else was propaganda designed to fill quotas and keep the meat grinder of war turning. Boot camp lasted 6 months. We learned to march in formation, to strip and clean a lasgun in toxic rain, to follow orders without question even when those orders made no sense. They broke us down first, stripping away whatever foolish notions we had about individuality, about choice, about the luxury of moral reasoning. Then they built us back up as soldiers, as instruments of the Emperor's will, as expendable assets in humanity's endless war for survival. I remember the first time I killed a man. Not an orc, not a heretic, not some alien abomination. A man, Imperial citizen, born under the same stars I was, raised on the same lies about duty and honor. He wore the uniform of the Severin Dominate, but underneath the rebel colors, he bled red like any of us. I put 3 last rounds in his chest and watched the light fade from his eyes, and all I could think was how young he looked, how frightened. That was on Heathguard, during the pacification campaign. We called it pacification because calling it what it really was would have been too honest. It was slaughter. Systematic, efficient, necessary slaughter of Imperial citizens who had the audacity to believe they could govern themselves. The Departamento Munitorum classified it as a training exercise. Real bullets, real casualties, but training nonetheless. We were learning how to kill our own species before they sent us to kill the alien ones. The irony was not lost on me even then. We spent our days executing men and women whose only crime was wanting freedom from the crushing weight of imperial bureaucracy, and our evenings listening to commissars lecture us about the sacred duty of protecting humanity from its enemies. The cognitive dissonance should have driven me mad. Instead, it taught me the first and most important lesson of military service. Truth is whatever your commanding officer says it is. Heathguard smelled like burning promethium and rotting corpses. The rebels had sabotaged the atmospheric processors before we made planetfall, so the air was thick with industrial toxins and the sweet stench of decay. We wore rebreathers when we could, but supplies were limited and replacements were rare. Most of us learned to breathe through our mouths and ignore the way the poisoned air made our lungs burn. Adaptation was survival. Complaints were weakness. I served under Colonel Marcus Vrain, a man who measured success in body counts and operational efficiency. He had been fighting rebels and heretics for 30 years, and the war had carved away everything soft in him, leaving only sharp edges and cold pragmatism. He never raised his voice, never showed anger or frustration, never displayed any emotion that might suggest he remembered what it felt like to be human. We feared him more than we feared the enemy. The enemy, at least, wanted to kill us quickly. Colonel Vrain believed in discipline through exhaustion, in breaking men down until all they had left was their training and their fear of disappointing him. We marched 20 kilometers a day in full kit, slept 4 hours out of every 24, and ate field rations that tasted like recycled cardboard and synthetic protein. Those who complained were given extra duties. Those who complained twice were flogged. Those who complained a third time disappeared. I learned not to complain. The weapon they issued me was a Mark IV infantry lasgun, serial number 7745 Delta Mordius. I memorized that number along with its weight fully charged, the sound it made when the power pack was running low, the way the barrel heated up after sustained fire. That lasgun became more familiar to me than my own face. I could field strip it blindfolded, recalibrate the focusing lens in complete darkness, and clear a jam while under heavy fire. It was the tool that kept me alive, and like any tool, it required constant maintenance and absolute respect. But tools break. Men break faster. On Heathguard, we lost 30% of our strength in the first month. Not to enemy action, but to accidents, equipment failures, and what the medical officers diplomatically called stress-related incidents. Men walked into moving vehicles, fell into reactor pits, or simply sat down one day and refused to stand up again. The mind has its limits, and war has a way of finding them. I watched Trooper Kellyan, a farm boy from the agri-world of Thessia, slowly lose his ability to distinguish between friend and foe. It started with nervous glances at his squad mates, progressed to accusations that they were trying to poison his rations, and ended with him trying to bayonet Sergeant Herrick during morning inspection. The commissar put a bolt round through his head before he could hurt anyone else. We left his body where it fell and continued the mission. There was no time for funerals, no energy for grief. That was the first time I truly understood what we were. Not soldiers in the romantic sense, not heroes or defenders of humanity. We were ammunition, measured by our remaining utility and discarded when we became more liability than asset. The Imperium has no shortage of worlds, no scarcity of population, no lack of young men and women willing to die for the Emperor. What it lacks is time, and time was always the enemy we could never defeat. The rebels on Heathguard fought with captured Imperial weapons, improvised explosives, and the desperate fury of people who knew they were going to die. They were not military formations in any organized sense, but they understood the terrain. They knew how to blend with the civilian population, and they had nothing left to lose. Those advantages made them more dangerous than entire orc warbands. We hunted them through the ruins of their own cities, following thermal signatures and blood trails through bombed-out hab blocks and collapsed industrial complexes. The architecture of Heathguard was typical of Imperial construction, massive, brutal, and designed more for psychological impact than practical habitability. The rebels used this against us, turning corridors into kill zones and balconies into sniper nests. Every door might conceal an ambush, every window might hide a marksman, every shadow might be the last thing we ever saw. I killed my second man in a maintenance tunnel beneath Manufacturing District 7. He was wounded, bleeding from a shrapnel wound in his leg, trying to crawl away from the sound of our boots echoing in the darkness. He could not have been more than 16 years old, probably a factory worker who had picked up a rifle when the rebellion started. When he saw my lasgun's targeting beam settle on his chest, he did not beg for mercy or try to negotiate. He just closed his eyes and waited. I hesitated. Not from compassion, but from a sudden, overwhelming sense of waste. Here was a young man who should have been learning a trade, starting a family, contributing to the stability of the Imperium. Instead, he was dying in a tunnel that reeked of industrial coolant and human excrement, killed by someone barely older than he was, for reasons that neither of us fully understood. The hesitation lasted maybe 3 seconds. Then training took over, and I pulled the trigger. The last beam punched through his sternum and stopped his heart instantly. He died with his eyes closed, probably dreaming of home. That night, I lay in my bunk and tried to calculate how many people I had killed since arriving on Heathguard. Direct kills were easy to count, but what about the artillery strikes I had called in? The air support I had coordinated? The intelligence I had provided that led to successful raids? By any honest accounting, I was responsible for the deaths of dozens of people, most of whom I had never seen and would never know. The mathematics of war are simple. You kill the enemy before the enemy kills you. Everything else is philosophy, and philosophy is a luxury that soldiers cannot afford. I learned to stop counting, to stop questioning, to stop feeling anything more than the basic animal satisfaction of surviving another day. The alternative was madness, and madness was just another form of casualty. We spent 11 months on Heathguard. 11 months of urban warfare, counterinsurgency operations, and what the propaganda broadcasts called morale and welfare activities. The morale and welfare activities consisted of public executions, mass deportations, and the systematic destruction of anything that might serve as a symbol of local identity. We burned libraries, demolished monuments, and executed anyone found in possession of pre-rebellion historical documents. We were not just conquering a world, we were erasing its memory. By the time the campaign ended, Heathguard looked like a different planet. The cities were ruins, the population was either dead or relocated, and the industrial infrastructure was so thoroughly demolished that it would take decades to rebuild. The Departamento Munitorum classified the operation as a complete success. We had achieved all strategic objectives with acceptable losses and minimal resource expenditure. the fact that we had effectively committed genocide was not mentioned in any official reports. I was promoted to Lance Corporal after Heathguard. The promotion came with a small increase in pay, the right to sleep in a slightly larger bunk, and the responsibility for ensuring that newer recruits did not make the same mistakes I had made. It also came with the knowledge that I was now invested in the system, that I had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. I was no longer just following orders, I was giving them. The transport ship that carried us away from Heathguard was an old sword-class frigate named Emperor's Judgment. It had been in service for over 2,000 years, and every surface showed the accumulated wear of countless deployments. The corridors were narrow, the air recyclers wheezed constantly, and the artificial gravity fluctuated unpredictably. But it was clean, it was safe, and it was taking us away from Heathguard. For the moment, that was enough. Space travel in the service of the Imperium is nothing like the heroic journeys described in propaganda vids. It is cramped, boring, and uncomfortable, punctuated by moments of absolute terror when something goes wrong with the ship's systems or when we encounter hostile forces. Most of our time was spent in enforced idleness, playing cards, maintaining equipment, and trying not to think about where we were going next. The ship's crew treated us with the casual indifference that naval personnel reserved for ground forces. We were cargo to them, human freight to be transported from one battle zone to another. They had their own concerns, their own dangers, their own ways of coping with the endless war. We respected the boundaries, and they left us alone. Our destination was Karax Prime, a hive world on the border between Imperial space and the Orc-held systems of the Ghoul Stars. Intelligence reports suggested that Orc raiders were using the world as a staging ground for deeper incursions into Imperial territory. Our mission was to locate and destroy the Orc bases, eliminate any human collaborators, and secure the world's strategic resources. It sounded routine. It was anything but. Karax Prime was dying. The hive cities were collapsing, the atmospheric processes were failing, and the population was fleeing to any world that would accept refugees. What remained was a mixture of die-hard loyalists too stubborn to leave, criminal elements taking advantage of the chaos, and Orc sympathizers who saw collaboration as their best chance for survival. It was, in other words, exactly the kind of nightmare scenario that the Imperial Guard was designed to handle. We made planetfall in dropship formation Delta 7, a standard combat insertion that brought us down in the ruins of Hive Secundus during what passed for local dawn. The sky was the color of old blood, stained by industrial pollution and the smoke from countless fires. The air tasted of metal and decay, and the sound of our boots on the broken rockcrete echoed through empty streets like gunshots. The Orcs had been there. Their crude glyphs were painted on every intact wall, their ramshackle vehicles littered the main thoroughfares, and the bodies of their victims hung from improvised gibbets throughout the lower districts. But the Orcs themselves were gone, moved on to some other target, leaving behind only the evidence of their presence and the human scavengers who fed on the wreckage. We established a forward operating base in what had once been a Departamento Munitorum supply depot. The building was intact, defensible, and close enough to the old Imperial Command Center to serve as a good observation post. More importantly, it had working water recyclers and a partially functional power grid. Luxury accommodations by Guard standards. The first week on Karax Prime passed quietly. We ran patrols through the dead sectors, established contact with surviving loyalist groups, and began the slow process of mapping the world's remaining infrastructure. Intelligence was scarce, communications were intermittent, and every piece of information we gathered suggested that the situation was worse than anyone had realized. The Orcs had not simply raided Karax Prime, they had infected it. Their spores were everywhere, growing in the dark corners of abandoned buildings, sprouting in the ruins of collapsed hab blocks, spreading through the water supplies and air recycling systems. Given time, those spores would mature into full-grown Orcs, creating an enemy that could never be completely eliminated. Every Imperial world touched by the Greenskins carried this hidden threat, this biological time bomb that could explode into violence at any moment. We started finding the collaborators during our second week planetside. They were easy to identify, better fed than the other survivors, better armed, and bearing the crude tattoos that Orc society used to mark its human servants. Some had been coerced into collaboration through threats against their families. Others had embraced it willingly, seduced by promises of power, or simply by the prospect of survival in a world where survival was the only victory that mattered. Colonel Vrain's standing orders regarding collaborators were explicit: summary execution for anyone found guilty of willful cooperation with Xenos forces. The definition of willful was left to our discretion, which meant that it was left to our prejudices, our fears, and our need to blame someone for the horror we were witnessing. I executed my first collaborator on a Tuesday. He was a middle-aged clerk who had helped the orcs identify which buildings contained strategic resources and which ones were expendable. He claimed he had been trying to save lives, that cooperation was the only way to prevent total massacre. He might have been telling the truth. It did not matter. The Colonel's orders were clear, and clear orders were all that stood between us and the chaos that consumed everything else. The man's name was Hendrik Voss. He had 2 children and a wife who was 7 months pregnant. They watched from a barricaded window as I put a last round through his skull. His body fell into a puddle of contaminated water, and the ripples spread outward until they reached the edges of the street. I ordered his family to dispose of the corpse. They were still Imperial citizens technically, and disposing of traitors was a civic duty. That night, I dreamed of Hendrik Voss. In the dream, he was still alive, still trying to explain his choices, still believing that reasonable people could find reasonable solutions to unreasonable problems. I woke up with the taste of blood in my mouth and the sound of last fire echoing in my ears. The dreams would continue for months, long after Karak's Prime was nothing but another entry in my service record. The orcs returned during our 3rd week on world. Not a raiding party, but a full war. Thousands of green-skinned killers led by a massive war boss whose roar could be heard from kilometers away. They came in ramshackle vehicles held together by scrap metal and blind faith, weapons that should not have functioned but somehow did, and an enthusiasm for violence that made our own training look sophisticated by comparison. We had perhaps 600 men. They had over 10,000 orcs, plus an unknown number of Gretchen, squigs, and whatever other monstrosities they had picked up along the way. The mathematics were simple. We were going to die. The only question was how much damage we could inflict before they overran our positions. Colonel Vrain called it a target-rich environment. He was right, in his way. There were certainly plenty of orcs to shoot at. The problem was that shooting them only seemed to make them angrier, and angry orcs were even more dangerous than normal orcs. They felt no fear, showed no mercy, and treated warfare as the ultimate form of entertainment. They were, in many ways, the perfect enemy, predictable in their unpredictability, honest in their brutality, and utterly committed to the only values that mattered in a galaxy at war. The first attack came at dawn, preceded by a thunderous wah that shook dust from the ceiling of our command bunker. Hundreds of orc vehicles charged across the open ground between the outer ruins and our defensive perimeter, their engines belching black smoke and their crews howling with bestial glee. They drove straight into our kill zones, apparently oblivious to the concentrated last fire and heavy weapons that tore through their ranks. It did not matter. For every orc vehicle we destroyed, 2 more took its place. For every orc we killed, 3 more appeared. They were not fighting a war in any sense we understood. They were celebrating, reveling in the pure joy of violence unleashed. Our disciplined fire and careful tactics were just part of the game to them, obstacles to overcome rather than threats to avoid. I spent that first battle crouched behind a makeshift barricade, firing controlled bursts at targets that seemed to multiply even as I watched. My lasgun grew hot in my hands, the power pack indicator dropping from green to amber to red as I poured fire into the green tide. When the pack ran dry, I slammed in a replacement and kept firing. When that one ran dry, I reached for another and found my ammunition pouch empty. Sergeant Harrick tossed me a spare pack without taking his eyes off the advancing orcs. His face was set in the expression of grim concentration that I had learned to associate with veteran non-commissioned officers, not afraid, exactly, but fully aware of how bad the situation was and determined to sell their lives as dearly as possible. He had been fighting orcs for 15 years, and he knew what we were up against. The first wave broke against our defenses like water against stone, leaving hundreds of orc corpses scattered across the killing ground. But water, given enough time and pressure, eventually wears away even the hardest stone. The second wave came an hour later, then the third, then the fourth. Each attack was smaller than the last, but our ammunition was running low and our casualties were mounting. Simple arithmetic suggested that we would be overwhelmed before nightfall. Colonel Vrain made the decision that saved us. though saved might be too generous a term for what followed. He called down an orbital bombardment on our own position, sacrificing the forward defensive lines to buy time for a fighting withdrawal to the secondary perimeter. The bombardment killed most of the attacking orcs, along with roughly half of our remaining men. It was, by any objective measure, a brilliant tactical decision. It was also mass murder of Imperial soldiers by Imperial command. I was in the command bunker when the bombardment began, so I survived the initial impact. The men in the forward trenches were not so lucky. They were vaporized instantly, along with their orc attackers, by macro cannon shells fired from orbit. One moment they were fighting for their lives, the next moment they were superheated plasma dispersing into the atmosphere. Clean, quick, efficient, the Emperor's mercy, as some called it. We fell back to the secondary perimeter under cover of the orbital fire, carrying our wounded and abandoning everything that was not essential to immediate survival. The orcs were regrouping for another assault, but the bombardment had bought us precious time to consolidate our defenses and redistribute our remaining ammunition. It had also taught them to respect Imperial firepower, though whether that would make them more cautious or more determined remained to be seen. The second battle began that evening, as the sun set behind clouds of smoke and toxic vapor. This time the orcs came more carefully, using the rubble and crater holes left by the bombardment as cover, advancing in short rushes rather than the headlong charges they had favored earlier. They were learning, adapting to our tactics the same way we were adapting to theirs. In a galaxy at war, even the most primitive species had to evolve or die. We held the secondary perimeter for 3 days. 3 days of constant fighting, brief snatches of sleep between assaults, and the gradual realization that we were not going to survive. Our ammunition was almost gone, our heavy weapons were running out of power, and the orcs showed no signs of losing interest in the game. They were having too much fun to stop now. On the 4th day, help arrived in the form of a Space Marine strike force from the Iron Hands chapter. 3 Thunderhawk gunships descended from orbit like avenging angels, their weapons systems carving paths of destruction through the orc ranks. Space Marines deployed from the gunship's assault ramps, their bolt rounds punching through orc armor as if it were made of paper. Within an hour, the entire WAG was either dead or retreating back into the wastelands. We had lost 430 men. The Space Marines had lost none. They extracted us from Carax Prime without ceremony, transferring us to a Navy transport that would take us to our next assignment. Before they left, their sergeant told Colonel Vrain that our acceptable resistance had helped contain the orc threat. High praise from the Adeptus Astartes. It did not make the dead any less dead. The journey to our next deployment took 6 months, most of which I spent in the ship's medical bay recovering from shrapnel wounds and something the medics called combat stress reaction. Combat stress reaction was the official term for what happened when a soldier's mind broke under the pressure of war. The symptoms included nightmares, uncontrollable tremors, and the tendency to see enemies in every shadow. The treatment consisted of drugs, enforced rest, and stern lectures about duty and courage from officers who had never experienced real combat. I dreamed every night during those 6 months, dreams of Hethgard's poisoned air, of Carax Prime's burning sky, of all the people I had killed and all the friends I had watched die. The dreams were always the same, faces without names, names without faces, and the constant sound of Las fire echoing in the distance. I would wake up sweating, reaching for a weapon that was not there, calling out warnings to comrades who were already dead. The medical officer, a tired-looking woman with prematurely grey hair, told me that the dreams would fade with time. She was wrong. 14 years later, I still dream of Hethgard and Carax Prime. I still wake up reaching for my rifle. The only difference is that I have learned to suffer in silence, to keep the screaming on the inside where it belongs. Our next assignment was Talon, a desert world famous for its armored regiments and its endless campaigns against orc raiders, chaos cultists, and occasionally each other. We were attached to the 12th Talon Desert Raiders as replacement personnel, filling gaps in their ranks left by casualties from previous deployments. It was a privilege, we were told. The Talon regiments were legendary for their skill, their courage, and their ability to win battles despite impossible odds. The reality was somewhat different. The 12th Talon was a broken unit, its ranks filled with shell-shocked veterans, green recruits, and men who had been deemed unsuitable for service with more prestigious formations. They had been fighting continuously for 3 years, rotating between different combat zones without ever returning to their homeworld. They were tired, bitter, and held together only by the iron discipline of their officers and the shared understanding that desertion meant death. Colonel Vrain was transferred to another unit, replaced by Major Kellyan Saurus, a Talon officer who had earned his rank through 30 years of service in the desert wastes. Major Saurus was everything Colonel Vrain had not been: emotional, unpredictable, and prone to making decisions based on instinct rather than careful analysis. His men loved him for it. They also died for it, in numbers that made our casualties on Karax Prime look modest. Talon itself was a world of endless sand, scorching days, and freezing nights. The native population lived in underground cities connected by vast tunnel networks, emerging only when necessary and always with heavy protective gear. The surface was home to sandstorms that could strip flesh from bone, temperature variations that could kill an unprotected human in minutes, and creatures that had evolved to thrive in conditions that would challenge even the most advanced technology. We spent 2 years on Talon, fighting a rotating cast of enemies who seemed to emerge from the desert like mirages. Orc raiders from the outer systems, chaos cultists who worshipped the endless storms, and occasionally other Imperial forces who had gotten lost in the wasteland and decided that we looked like a threat. The desert was neutral in these conflicts, killing everyone with equal enthusiasm regardless of their allegiance or their cause. I learned to navigate by the stars, to find water in places that looked completely barren, and to sleep with sand in my eyes, my mouth, and my equipment. I learned which creatures could be eaten safely and which ones would kill you just by touching them. I learned to fight in conditions where visibility was measured in meters, and the only reliable landmarks were the burning wrecks of vehicles that had failed to make it through the latest storm. Most importantly, I learned that survival was not about being strong or brave or clever. Survival was about being lucky, and luck was a finite resource that had to be carefully hoarded and judiciously spent. Every day I survived was a day closer to the moment when my luck would run out. The only question was whether that moment would come during combat, during a sandstorm, or during one of the long marches across the empty wasteland between one objective and the next. The fighting on Talon followed a predictable pattern. We would receive intelligence about enemy activity in a particular region, march across the desert to investigate, and discover that the intelligence was either outdated, inaccurate, or deliberately misleading. Sometimes we found the enemy anyway, usually in greater numbers than expected and better prepared than our briefings had suggested. Sometimes we found nothing but sand, heat, and the bones of previous expeditions that had followed the same false leads. The worst part was the waiting. Long stretches of time when nothing happened, when we sat in our positions and watched the horizon for signs of movement that never came. The desert played tricks on the mind, creating phantom shapes in the distance, whispering voices in the wind, and the constant feeling that we were being watched by invisible enemies. Men who had survived pitched battles against overwhelming odds would crack under the pressure of sitting in the sand for days at a time, staring at nothing. I was promoted to corporal during our 2nd year on Talon, following the death of Sergeant Harrick in a skirmish with chaos cultists. The promotion came with additional responsibilities, a modest increase in pay, and the privilege of watching younger soldiers make the same mistakes I had made on Heathguard and Karax Prime. It also came with the knowledge that I was now officially invested in the system, responsible not just for my own survival but for the survival of others. Leading men in combat is different from fighting as a common soldier. As a soldier, you only have to worry about following orders and staying alive. As a leader, you have to worry about giving orders that will keep other people alive, making decisions that will affect their families, their futures, and their chances of seeing another sunrise. Every choice becomes a moral calculation. Every mistake becomes someone else's tragedy. I lost my first man 3 weeks after my promotion. Trooper Marcus Kane, 19 years old, from an agri-world whose name I never learned. He was killed by a sniper during a routine patrol, shot through the head while examining what looked like an abandoned supply cache. The cache was a trap. The sniper was long gone by the time we located his position, and Trooper Kane was dead before his body hit the sand. Clean, quick, efficient. Just another casualty in humanity's endless war. I wrote a letter to Kane's parents, as regulations required. I told them that their son had died serving the Emperor, that his sacrifice would not be forgotten, that he had faced death with courage and dignity. All of it was true, in its way. All of it was also completely meaningless. Their son was dead because I had sent him to examine a suspicious object instead of calling for explosive ordnance disposal. My decision, my responsibility, my guilt to carry for the rest of my life. The letters became routine after that. I wrote them for Trooper Vex, killed by an orc slugger round during a night ambush. For Trooper Morrison, who died when his breathing apparatus failed during a sandstorm. For Trooper Kellyan, shot by a chaos cultist who detonated a grenade belt rather than be captured. For dozens of others whose names I have forgotten but whose faces still haunt my dreams. Each letter followed the same template: died serving the Emperor, sacrifice not forgotten, courage and dignity in the face of death. The words lost all meaning through repetition, became just another administrative duty to be completed between combat missions. But the families needed to hear them, needed to believe that their loved ones had died for something meaningful, and lying to grieving parents was just another part of a soldier's job. The Chaos Cultists were the worst enemies we faced on Tallarn. The Orcs were dangerous but predictable, motivated by simple bloodlust and a desire for violence. The Cultists were human, which meant they could think, plan, and anticipate our tactics. They were also completely insane, driven by religious fervor to commit acts that defied both reason and basic human decency. Fighting them was like fighting a nightmare given form. They used the desert against us, poisoning water sources, setting traps in seemingly safe locations, and spreading disease through abandoned settlements. They turned captured Imperial personnel into living bombs, mind-wiped slaves who would detonate explosive devices when they encountered friendly forces. They sacrificed entire communities to summon daemons, creatures from the warp that existed only to spread pain and terror. I saw my first daemon during our 18th month on Tallarn. We were investigating reports of cultist activity in an abandoned mining settlement, following up on intelligence that proved to be entirely accurate for once. The cultists were there, along with something else, something that should not have existed in any universe governed by rational physical laws. It looked like a man, if men were 3 meters tall and made of shadow and malice. It moved through our defensive positions like smoke, ignoring last fire and explosive rounds as if they were gentle breezes. When it touched a man, that man would scream once and then collapse, his life force drained away in seconds. When it spoke, which it did rarely, its voice sounded like breaking glass and distant thunder. We eventually killed it, though killed might not be the right word for what we did. We poured enough concentrated fire into its approximate location that it became unstable, losing cohesion and fading back into whatever realm had spawned it. The process took 4 hours, cost us 37 men, and left the survivors with nightmares that would last for years. But we had won, technically, and technical victories were all that mattered in official reports. The daemon's presence had corrupted everything within a 5-kilometer radius. Plants withered and died, animals fled or turned savage, and the very air felt thick with malevolent energy. We were ordered to evacuate the entire region and call down an orbital bombardment to cleanse the area. 6 months later, the soil was still sterile, the water was still toxic, and sensitive equipment would malfunction if brought too close to the impact zone. That was the moment I truly understood what we were fighting. Not just orcs or rebels or alien species competing for the same resources. We were fighting the universe itself, holding back forces that wanted to remake reality according to principles that would destroy everything human, everything rational, everything decent. The Imperium was not perfect, but it was sane, and sanity was the most precious thing in a galaxy gone mad. We were rotated off Tallarn after 2 years of continuous deployment. 2 years of sand, heat, and endless warfare had left us physically exhausted and mentally scarred, but we had done our duty. The regiment's casualty reports showed an 87% turnover rate, meaning that fewer than 1 man in 10 had survived the entire deployment. By Imperial Guard standards, that was considered acceptable. Our next assignment was ship duty, serving as security personnel aboard Navy vessels patrolling the Outer Rim territories. It sounded like a vacation after Tallarn, and in some ways it was. We had regular meals, clean water, and sleeping quarters that were actually enclosed. We also had regular gravity, recycled air that did not taste like sand, and the comforting knowledge that the ship's void shields would protect us from most conventional weapons. Ship duty was also mind-numbingly boring. We spent months at a time traveling between star systems, our only responsibilities being guard duty, weapons maintenance, and the occasional boarding action when we encountered suspicious vessels. Most of our time was spent in enforced idleness, reading old books, playing cards, and trying not to think about what would happen when we reached our destination. The Imperial Navy operated on different principles than the Guard. Navy personnel were professionals, trained for specific technical roles and expected to serve for decades rather than the few years that most guardsmen survived. They looked down on us as temporary passengers, necessary for certain types of operations but not really part of the ship's crew. The feeling was mutual. They fought their battles from a distance, using technology and tactics that we barely understood. We preferred our enemies close enough to see their faces. I served aboard 3 different ships during my tour of naval duty: the Righteous Fury, a grand cruiser that patrolled the shipping lanes between major hive worlds; the Emperor's Wrath, a battle cruiser that hunted pirates in the Outer Rim systems; and the Divine Providence, a massive battleship that served as flagship for Battlefleet Obscurus. Each ship had its own culture, its own traditions, and its own way of dealing with the endless boredom of space travel. The most memorable action during my naval service occurred aboard the Emperor's Wrath, when we intercepted a Chaos Raider that had been preying on Imperial merchant vessels. The Raider was a converted Imperial frigate, its hull covered with blasphemous symbols and crewed by humans who had sold their souls for power and forbidden knowledge. They fought with the desperate fury of the damned, knowing that capture meant execution and that death might be preferable to what their dark masters would do to them for failure. We boarded the Raider after a brutal void battle that left both ships crippled and drifting. The boarding action was supposed to be routine: secure the vessel, capture any surviving crew for interrogation, and salvage whatever intelligence we could find. Nothing about it was routine. The interior of the Chaos vessel had been transformed into something that barely qualified as architecture. Corridors twisted in directions that hurt to contemplate, walls were covered with symbols that seemed to move when observed directly, and the air itself was thick with whispers in languages that predated human speech. Walking through those passages was like navigating the inside of a living nightmare, and several of our men simply refused to continue after the first few compartments. We found the crew in what had once been the ship's cathedral, now converted into a shrine dedicated to powers that shall remain nameless. They had been dead for hours, killed by their own hand in some final ritual that left their bodies arranged in patterns that made my eyes water to look at. The smell was indescribable, not just the stench of death, but something else, something that suggested corruption on a level that transcended mere physical decay. The ship's cogitator systems had been infected with something that turned machine spirits into gibbering madmen. Every screen displayed impossible geometries, every speaker broadcast the sound of screaming that came from no human throat, and every automated system seemed designed to inflict maximum psychological damage on anyone foolish enough to interact with it. We eventually had to cut the power to the entire vessel just to silence the electronic cacophony. What we found in the captain's quarters changed my understanding of what the enemy truly was: maps showing Imperial shipping routes, patrol schedules, and defensive positions. Communication logs detailing contacts with other Chaos vessels, coordination of attacks, and intelligence gathered from sources within the Imperium itself. Most disturbing of all, personnel files on Imperial Guard units, complete with tactical assessments, psychological profiles, and recommendations for how best to break their morale. They had been studying us, learning our methods, our weaknesses, our fears. The Chaos forces were not mindless destroyers driven only by bloodlust and madness. They were organized, methodical, and utterly committed to the complete annihilation of everything we held sacred. They understood us better than we understood ourselves, and they were using that knowledge to systematically dismantle the Imperium from within. I spent 6 hours aboard that vessel, searching through compartments that defied geometry and examining artifacts that should never have been created. 6 hours that felt like 6 years, surrounded by evidence of humanity's capacity for corruption and the galaxy's infinite appetite for suffering. By the time we withdrew to our own ship, I understood why the Imperium's official policy toward Chaos was immediate and total destruction. Some knowledge was too dangerous to preserve, some enemies too corrupting to capture alive. The Emperor's Wrath destroyed the Raider with melter torpedoes fired at point-blank range. The explosion was visible for light minutes in every direction, a brief star that consumed both the vessel and everything aboard it. The captain logged it as a successful interdiction operation. The official records made no mention of what we had found, what we had learned, or why half the boarding party requested transfers to different units within a week of our return to port. My naval service ended when the Divine Providence was reassigned to the Gothic sector, and my regiment was transferred to ground operations in the Segmentum Solar. I had served aboard Imperial warships for 18 months, participated in 7 boarding actions, and survived 3 major void battles. The experience had taught me that the galaxy was larger and more dangerous than I had ever imagined, that humanity's enemies came in forms that challenged both reason and sanity. It had also taught me that the war we were fighting could not be won in any conventional sense. Victory was not conquest or the elimination of our enemies. Victory was simply continuing to exist, maintaining the thin line between civilization and chaos for another day, another year, another generation. We were not heroes in any romantic sense. We were antibodies in the galaxy's immune system, fighting an infection that could never be completely cured. Our next assignment brought us back to ground operations on Mordia itself, the industrial world where I had been recruited nearly a decade earlier. The planet had changed in my absence, transformed from a relatively prosperous manufacturing center into a fortress world preparing for siege. Orbital defense platforms crowded the sky, underground bunkers extended kilometers into the planet's core, and every citizen between the ages of 16 and 60 had been conscripted into the planetary defense forces. The threat was Orc invasion, a massive war, led by a war boss called Scarjaw the Despoiler. Intelligence estimates suggested that over 2 million Orcs were massing in nearby systems, along with their usual collection of Gretchen, Squigs, and ramshackle war machines. The invasion was expected within 6 months, and preparations were proceeding with the grim efficiency that characterized Imperial military planning. I was assigned to the 15th Mordian Shock Troops, an elite formation tasked with defending the primary Hive City's industrial district. The irony was not lost on me. I had left Mordia as a recruited civilian and returned as a veteran soldier, only to find myself defending the very factories where I had once worked as a child laborer. The wheel of fate, it seemed, had a cruel sense of humor. The preparations for siege warfare were comprehensive and depressing. Food rationing was implemented to extend supplies for an indefinite period. Civilian populations were relocated to underground shelters that had been stocked with weapons, ammunition, and instructions for urban guerrilla warfare. Industrial facilities were rigged with demolition charges to deny them to the enemy. Every street corner was fortified, every building was turned into a potential strongpoint, and every citizen was given basic military training. The children were the hardest part. I watched 10-year-old boys learning to field strip lasguns, 12-year-old girls practicing grenade-throwing techniques, and teenagers barely old enough to shave being taught how to construct improvised explosive devices. They approached their training with the same enthusiasm that children on more peaceful worlds might show for games or sports. War was all they knew, all they had ever known, and they accepted it as the natural order of things. I found myself assigned to training duties, passing on hard-won knowledge to recruits who might live long enough to use it. Teaching young soldiers how to dig proper foxholes, how to maintain their equipment under combat conditions, how to recognize the signs of enemy infiltration. Most importantly, teaching them how to die well, how to sell their lives for maximum tactical advantage when survival was no longer possible. The lessons were practical rather than inspirational. How to distinguish between different types of incoming fire by sound, which wounds could be treated in the field, and which ones required immediate evacuation. How to continue fighting with broken bones, internal bleeding, and the kind of injuries that would cripple a civilian. How to make peace with death without surrendering the will to live. The recruits were eager, enthusiastic, and doomed. I could see it in their eyes. The same bright confidence that I had once possessed, the same belief that training and determination would be enough to see them through. They had not yet learned that war was not a test to be passed or a challenge to be overcome. War was entropy given form, chaos made manifest, the universe's way of reminding humanity that survival was never guaranteed. The Orcs arrived ahead of schedule, as Orcs always did. Their advanced scouts appeared in the outer system 3 months before our intelligence had predicted, followed by the main fleet within days. The invasion began with orbital bombardments that turned entire city districts into smoking craters, followed by drop pod assaults that deposited Orc forces directly into our defensive positions. But this was not the random chaotic assault that characterized most Orc invasions. Scarjaw the Despoiler had learned from previous defeats. incorporating captured Imperial tactics into his battle plans and demonstrating a level of strategic thinking that made him far more dangerous than the average war boss. His forces struck at communication centers, supply depots, and command bunkers with precision that suggested careful reconnaissance and detailed planning. The first wave hit our sector at dawn on a Tuesday. Hundreds of Orc assault troops, supported by crude but effective artillery, descended on our fortified positions like a green avalanche. They came screaming out of the smoke with crude weapons and primitive armor, but they came in overwhelming numbers and with the kind of mindless courage that made them nearly unstoppable. We held our positions for 6 hours, pouring disciplined fire into the Orc ranks and calling down artillery strikes on their assembly areas. Our defensive works had been expertly constructed, our fields of fire were optimal, and our ammunition supplies were adequate for a sustained engagement. By every measure of military science, we should have been able to repel the attack with acceptable casualties. We had not accounted for the Orcs' complete indifference to casualties. They kept coming despite losses that would have broken any sane species, climbing over the bodies of their fallen comrades to reach our firing positions. When their crude weapons jammed or ran out of ammunition, they drew massive choppers and crude pistols. When those weapons failed, they used their bare hands and filed teeth. Nothing could stop them except death, and sometimes not even that. I emptied 4 power packs during that first engagement, firing controlled bursts at targets that seemed to multiply even as I watched. My lasgun grew so hot that the barrel began to warp, forcing me to switch to my sidearm when the primary weapon became unusable. The Orcs kept coming, stepping through withering fire as if it were gentle rain, their crude features twisted into expressions of savage joy. The breakthrough came at our western flank, where a concentrated Orc assault overwhelmed a weak point in our defensive line. Hundreds of green-skinned killers poured through the gap, attacking our positions from behind while their comrades continued the frontal assault. We were caught between 2 fires, fighting enemies who seemed to emerge from every direction at once. The order to fall back came too late to save most of the 15th shock troops. We lost 70% of our strength in the first day of fighting, killed or wounded during the chaotic retreat through streets clogged with rubble and civilian refugees. Those of us who survived regrouped at secondary positions, integrated with other broken units, and prepared for the next assault. I was promoted to sergeant during the reorganization, not because of any particular heroism, but because all the existing sergeants were dead. Command positions in besieged cities changed hands frequently, filled by whoever was alive and competent enough to give orders that made tactical sense. Leadership became a matter of survival rather than qualification, and survival was increasingly a matter of luck. The siege of Mordia lasted 8 months. 8 months of continuous fighting, brief periods of relative quiet between assaults, and the gradual realization that we were not going to win. The Orcs controlled the orbital space around the planet, preventing resupply or reinforcement from the wider Imperium. Our ammunition was running low, our food supplies were nearly exhausted, and our casualty rates were unsustainable. But the Orcs were learning, adapting to our tactics the same way we were adapting to theirs. They began using captured Imperial equipment, integrating human weapons and vehicles into their ramshackle war machines. Worse, they were using captured humans as advisors, turncoats who provided intelligence about our defensive positions and tactical procedures. The war was changing both sides, forcing evolution that neither species had anticipated. The breaking point came during the 6th month of siege, when Orc forces penetrated the primary hive's lower levels and began fighting their way toward the industrial core. If they reached the main power generators, the entire defensive grid would collapse, and organized resistance would become impossible. We received orders to hold the generator complex at all costs, which in military terminology meant that we were expected to die where we stood. The final battle lasted 3 days. 3 days of fighting in confined spaces, using improvised weapons and salvaged equipment, supported by civilians who had volunteered to fight rather than face capture. The Orcs came in waves, each one smaller than the last but more desperate, more vicious, more determined to achieve victory regardless of cost. They had invested too much in this siege to accept defeat now. I killed my last Orc with a combat knife, stabbing the creature repeatedly in its massive chest until its crude heart finally stopped beating. My lasgun was empty, my sidearm was broken, and my ammunition pouches contained nothing but empty power packs and spent shell casings. The Orc was larger than me, stronger than me, and armed with a weapon that could have cut me in half with a single blow. But I was faster, and speed was all that mattered in the confined spaces where we fought. The orc died with what might have been a smile on its brutal features. Even in death, it seemed to be enjoying itself, pleased with the quality of opposition it had encountered. There was something almost admirable about its attitude, a pure honesty that human soldiers rarely displayed. It had come to fight, it had fought well, and it had died as it had lived. In its way, it was more honest than any of us. Relief came on the morning of the fourth day, when Space Marine strike forces from the Imperial Fists chapter made planetfall and began systematically eliminating orc positions. Their arrival turned the tide of battle in a matter of hours, forcing the surviving orcs to retreat or face annihilation by enemies they could not hope to defeat. Within a week, organized orc resistance had collapsed, and the siege was officially declared over. We had lost 92% of our strength during the siege. Out of nearly 50,000 defenders who had been present when the orcs first arrived, fewer than 4,000 survived to see liberation. The city itself was ruins, its industrial capacity destroyed, its civilian population reduced to a fraction of pre-war levels. By any objective measure, it was a catastrophic defeat disguised as a strategic victory. I was awarded the Medallion Crimson for exceptional valor under extreme circumstances, a decoration that came with a small pension increase and the right to wear a piece of colored metal on my dress uniform. The citation praised my unwavering dedication to duty and inspirational leadership during the darkest hours of the siege. It made no mention of the men who had died under my command, the civilians I had been unable to protect, or the nightmares that would haunt my sleep for years afterward. The survivors of the siege were transferred to different units, scattered across the galaxy to fill gaps in formations that had suffered their own catastrophic losses. I was assigned to the 23 Acadian Shock Troops, an elite formation with a reputation for discipline, professionalism, and an unusually high survival rate. It was considered a reward for distinguished service, though I had learned to be suspicious of anything the military classified as a reward. Cadia was the fortress world that guarded the Eye of Terror, humanity's eternal vigil against the forces of chaos. The entire planet was a military base, its population consisting entirely of soldiers, support personnel, and the families that served both. Every citizen was a soldier from birth, trained to fight before they could properly walk, indoctrinated with tactical knowledge and strategic thinking as thoroughly as other worlds taught basic literacy. The Cadians were professional soldiers in a way that few other regiments could claim. They fought with disciplined precision rather than desperate courage, using careful tactics rather than raw determination to achieve their objectives. They were also survivors, veterans of countless campaigns who had learned to balance aggression with caution, courage with common sense. They accepted me as a fellow professional, someone who had earned his rank through competence rather than political connections. My new commander was Colonel Jarek Kane, a Cadian officer who had been fighting Chaos forces for over 20 years. He was a thin, intense man with prematurely gray hair and eyes that seemed to see everything. His soldiers respected him not because of his rank, but because of his ability to bring them through impossible situations with minimal casualties. In a profession where survival was the ultimate measure of success, that made him nearly legendary. Colonel Kane believed in thorough preparation, detailed intelligence, and the kind of flexible tactics that allowed for rapid adaptation to changing circumstances. He also believed in taking care of his men, ensuring they were properly equipped, adequately rested, and clearly briefed on their objectives. It was a refreshing change from commanders who treated soldiers as expendable resources rather than valuable assets. Our first mission together was a reconnaissance operation in the Agrippina sector, investigating reports of unusual chaos activity near the Thraxian Nebula. Intelligence suggested that heretic forces were using the nebula as a base for raids against Imperial shipping lanes, but the details were vague and the source was questionable. It was exactly the kind of mission that usually ended with entire companies disappearing without explanation. The journey to the Thraxian Nebula took 2 months aboard the transport vessel Stalwart Defender, a converted merchant ship that had been equipped with basic military accommodations. The conditions were cramped but adequate, and the crew was competent enough to keep us alive during the passage through the warp. More importantly, they had enough experience with military passengers to leave us alone, allowing us to focus on mission preparation and equipment maintenance. Colonel Kane used the journey to conduct intensive training exercises, refining our tactical procedures and ensuring that every man knew his role in the various contingencies we might face. The exercises were realistic, demanding, and educational. They also served to weld the various elements of the regiment into a cohesive fighting force, something that was essential given the mixed backgrounds of our personnel. The Thraxian Nebula was a region of space where normal physical laws seemed to operate under different principles. Gravity fluctuated unpredictably, electromagnetic radiation followed impossible trajectories, and the boundary between real space and the warp was thinner than anywhere else in the sector. Ships had been known to disappear while traveling through the nebula, only to reappear years later with their crews aged decades or driven mad by experiences that could not be described in human language. We made planetfall on Thrax Prime, a world that had been abandoned by the Imperium nearly a century earlier when the local star began exhibiting signs of instability. The planet's surface was a wasteland of crystallized atmosphere and frozen oceans, lit by the sickly light of a sun that was slowly dying. The only signs of life were the chaos forces that had established bases in the ruins of the old imperial cities, feeding off the dark energies that permeated the entire system. The reconnaissance mission was supposed to last 6 weeks. We would establish a covert observation post, gather intelligence on enemy strength and intentions, and withdraw before our presence could be detected. Simple, routine, and exactly the kind of operation that experienced soldiers could execute without significant casualties. Everything that could go wrong went wrong within the first week. The Chaos Forces were not raiders or cultists operating without central coordination. They were a disciplined military formation led by a Chaos Space Marine warband, equipped with stolen Imperial technology and supported by human auxiliary forces that had been corrupted by decades of exposure to warp energies. They knew we were coming, had prepared defenses specifically designed to counter our tactics, and were using the nebula's unusual properties to mask their true strength. We walked into an ambush 3 days after making planetfall. The enemy had used the frozen terrain to conceal prepared positions, allowing them to engage us from multiple directions simultaneously while remaining invisible to our reconnaissance equipment. We lost half the advance guard in the first volley, killed by weapons that fired ammunition infused with warp energy, projectiles that ignored conventional armor, and inflicted wounds that would not heal properly. The fighting retreat that followed tested every skill I had learned during 14 years of military service. We were outnumbered, outgunned, and operating in terrain that favored the defenders. Our only advantage was superior training and the kind of disciplined fire control that came from years of fighting impossible odds. We used that advantage to break contact, withdraw to a defensible position, and call for extraction. The extraction never came. The transport ship that was supposed to retrieve us had vanished during a routine patrol, along with its escort vessels and the entire task force that had brought us to the system. We were stranded on a dying world, surrounded by enemies who wanted to capture us alive for reasons that were probably worse than death, cut off from any possibility of reinforcement or resupply. Colonel Kane made the decision that saved us, though salvation is probably too generous a term for what followed. He ordered a fighting advance toward the planet's primary spaceport, gambling that we could capture an enemy vessel and escape the system before our luck ran out completely. It was a desperate plan with minimal chances of success, but desperation was all we had left. The march to the spaceport took 10 days, 10 days of continuous skirmishing with enemy forces that seemed to anticipate our every move. They harassed us constantly but never committed to a decisive engagement, content to wear us down through attrition while we struggled toward an objective that might not even be reachable. It was psychological warfare at its most sophisticated, designed to break our will long before it broke our bodies. We reached the spaceport with fewer than 200 men, roughly half our original strength. The facility was defended, but not as heavily as intelligence reports had suggested. The enemy had concentrated their forces elsewhere, apparently confident that we would never make it this far. Their confidence was understandable but ultimately misplaced. Desperation makes men capable of things that would be impossible under normal circumstances. The final assault lasted 6 hours. 6 hours of close-quarters fighting in confined spaces, using tactics that bordered on suicidal but somehow achieved their objectives. We captured 3 enemy vessels, killed or drove off the defending forces, and discovered intelligence that explained everything we had experienced since arriving in the system. The Chaos Forces were not using the nebula as a base for random raids. They were preparing for a major offensive against the Cadian Gate, massing strength for an assault that would threaten the entire sector. Our reconnaissance mission had inadvertently uncovered the preliminary stages of what could become the largest Chaos invasion in centuries. The information was too important to risk losing, even if transmitting it meant revealing our position to every enemy force in the system. We transmitted the intelligence data and prepared for immediate departure, knowing that enemy reinforcements would arrive within hours. The captured vessels were crude but functional, their machine spirits corrupted by chaos influence but still capable of basic operations. Getting them operational required technical skills that most of us lacked, along with a willingness to interact with technology that had been tainted by forces that should not exist. The escape from Thrax Prime was a nightmare of void combat, pursued by enemy vessels that seemed to ignore the normal limitations of physics. Our ships were slower, less maneuverable, and crewed by soldiers who had never received proper naval training. We should have been destroyed within minutes of leaving the planet's atmosphere. Instead, we somehow managed to reach the system's edge and enter the warp, though whether our escape was due to skill, luck, or the intervention of powers we did not understand remains unclear. The journey back to Imperial space took 4 months, most of which I spent in the ship's medical bay recovering from wounds that refused to heal properly. The weapons used by Chaos forces left injuries that festered despite medical treatment, infections that spread through both flesh and spirit. The ship's medic, a veteran of 30 years' service, admitted that he had never seen anything like them. During those 4 months, I had time to reflect on everything I had experienced since leaving the recruiting station on Mordia. 14 years of continuous warfare, dozens of campaigns, hundreds of battles, and thousands of individual moments where survival had been measured in seconds rather than hours. I had served on 16 different worlds, fought 11 different types of enemy, and watched more men die than I could count. What had I accomplished? What had any of us accomplished? The galaxy was still at war, the Imperium was still besieged by enemies that multiplied faster than they could be destroyed, and humanity was still clinging to existence through a combination of brutal necessity and blind faith. Nothing had changed except the names on the casualty reports and the coordinates of the worlds where young men went to die. But perhaps that was enough. Perhaps the simple act of bearing witness, of surviving long enough to remember, was its own form of victory. Someone had to carry the memory of all those who had fallen. Someone had to remember their names and their faces and the way they had died. If that was my purpose, if that was what 14 years of service had taught me, then perhaps it was worth the cost. The transport that carried us back to Cadia was met by naval vessels that escorted us to the fortress world with honors appropriate to our achievement. We had gathered intelligence that would save millions of lives, prevented a chaos offensive that could have shattered the Imperial defenses, and demonstrated the kind of courage under impossible circumstances that made the Guard legendary. We were heroes, officially, though heroes was not how any of us felt. Colonel Kane was promoted to general and transferred to sector command. The surviving members of the regiment were awarded the Imperial Laurel and granted extended leave on worlds of their choice. I was offered a commission, the opportunity to become an officer and train the next generation of soldiers who would face the same challenges we had faced. I accepted, not because I wanted the responsibility, but because someone had to pass on the lessons we had learned. This is the truth of military service in the 41st millennium. We are not the heroes of propaganda vids or the glorious warriors of ancient legend. We are ordinary people doing extraordinary things because someone has to, because the alternative is too terrible to contemplate. We fight not for glory or conquest, but for the simple right to exist, to continue drawing breath in a galaxy that seems determined to snuff out human life. The Emperor protects, they say, but he protects through the actions of mortal men and women who choose to stand between civilization and chaos. Every guardsman who holds his position against impossible odds, every soldier who dies far from home in service to strangers he will never meet, every veteran who passes on hard-won knowledge to recruits who may live long enough to use it, is an instrument of that protection. We are the ones who stand watch in the dark places where evil breeds. We are the ones who carry the fight to enemies that exist only to destroy everything we hold sacred. We are the ones who pay the price, in blood and sanity, and the slow erosion of everything that makes us human so that others can sleep safely in their beds. This is what it means to be a soldier in service to the God Emperor of mankind. This is the grim reality of life in the Imperial Guard. This is the truth they never tell you when they pin on your first set of rank insignia and send you off to die on worlds whose names you cannot pronounce. The galaxy is vast, dark, and filled with horrors that defy description, but it is also filled with ordinary people who choose to stand and fight rather than surrender to despair. As long as that remains true, as long as there are men and women willing to take up arms in defense of humanity, there is hope. Not much hope, perhaps, but enough. The Emperor protects, and we protect the Emperor.